So been thinking a bit lately about fencing in rewilding projects. Kind of thought stimulated by Steve Carver. He sent me a nice paper that he wrote in British Wildlife a while back. I've not actually read the paper yet, so this is some initial thoughts. I'll do a rerun of this once I've read the paper later today, but just some initial thoughts. It's very hard to think why you would actually need fencing within a rewilding project, ultimately at least, especially not to keep things in your rewilding site. I think there can be good reasons to have fencing to keep larger animals from entering certain areas within or on the edge of rewilding sites, such as kind of railway lines or motorways. So, I know the New Forest isn't a great example, but it's the one that's closest to home for me. There's obviously railway lines that cross the New Forest, and those are fenced. They're not to keep animals in the New Forest, they're to keep them from wandering on the railway line. So if you have a kind of a rewilding landscape kind of edged by a railway corridor, then clearly you'll need fencing. Don't see any problem with that personally. But I don't think we want to be fencing to keep animals in, especially when we start to scale up. Maybe in the early years of a project, there might be reason to use fencing. Kind of depends on the character of your rewilding project, really. If it's entirely passive and you're not kind of introducing any species, then why would you need fencing at all? Whereas if it's a kind of a trophic rewilding project where you're using kind of wilded cattle as a surrogate for aurochs, and some sort of horse or pony as a surrogate for wild horses, then you probably have very good reason to use fencing, whatever the size of your rewilding area, just to keep those animals in, because inevitably they will wander out into agricultural landscapes otherwise, and there's various reasons why that can't really happen. Although obviously in Europe, in the mainland Europe, you've got wild bison that aren't fenced in some sites, quite rightly too, and they do wander out into agricultural areas, and that has to be managed, and it's managed reasonably successfully without the use of fencing in some areas. But again, they tend to, where fencing is used, it's tend to keep animals off of crops rather than to keep them in wilder landscapes. So I think it does kind of depend. Obviously beavers should not be in fenced enclosures. We should just stop doing that. I think it just gives the government an excuse to delay licensing a wild release of beavers by constantly coming up with new projects to put beavers in enclosures. That really does need to stop. And I think we probably need to stop using surrogates of a wild boar as well. You can see why, if you're using domestic pigs instead of wild boar, then clearly you want to fence your domestic pigs onto your rewilding site. But why on earth are we still using domestic pigs instead of having a strategy for the recovery of wild boar across the country? Just don't really see the sense of that. We really need somebody to champion wild boar. Chantal Lyons is producing a book which hopefully will be the kick off a whole new appreciation of wild boar as a key conservation species, target species for the UK. So I'm looking forward to that book coming out. But yeah, just a few incoherent initial thoughts on fencing. Avoid it wherever possible, especially don't use it within rewilding sites. So internal fencing, I mean there are circumstances where it is sensible. For instance, if you have a chalk grassland patch within your larger rewilding site that's a triple SI and is a very high biodiversity value and is kind of assembled under the influence of old farming systems and livestock grazing, then I can see a sense in having some sort of stock fencing for that triple SI specifically, your chalk grassland patch specifically, so you can continue targeted management for the time being until your chalk wildflowers spread out from that source site, spread out from the triple SI to gradually colonise your wider rewilding site. So yeah, if you've got a very high quality habitat embedded within a larger rewilding site that does depend on some sort of targeted conservation management with livestock, then yes, fences will probably be necessary. It kind of detracts from the wild atmosphere and kind of philosophy of your project perhaps, but you know, it can be necessary, and if it's triple SI then it's probably legally required as well to ensure you can actually manage the site to maintain it in favourable condition. So anyway, I can go off and read Steve's paper, I think, so I can come up with some more in-depth thoughts.